Hello and a very warm welcome to this episode of the Ponsonby and Massie podcast. As we record, it is 2 a.m. Yes, we're very enthusiastic podcasters because we're bringing you the result of the Hamilton Larkhall and Stonehouse by-election. Let's just take a quick look at the figures for those of you who are joining us on YouTube. It's a Labour gain, a Labour victory with a majority of 602. Davy Russell, the Labour candidate, 8,559 votes. The SNP, who have lost the seat, came second, 7,957. Reform, 7,088, with the Conservatives, Liberal Democrats and Greens bringing up the rear. In terms of the share of the vote, Labour 31.6%, the SNP 29.4%. Reform, from an absolute standing start, an astonishing 26.1%. And in comparison to the difference in the share of the vote in that constituency in 2021, the Labour vote marginally down by 2 percentage points. The SNP vote, though, down by a massive 17%. They had 46% of the vote in the constituency in 2021. And of course, Reform plus 26.1%. Delighted to say that not only is Alex here to chew over this, but the Labour MSP, Paul Sweeney, who joins us as well. So, Alex, before you hand to Paul, your takeaway from a result which is quite surprising, really, given the narrative during the campaign.
Well, I think the first thing to say, Bernard, is that it's an excellent result for people who run a political podcast focusing on Scottish politics. Because we like news and surprising things and shiny things, and so from that point of view, from a news point of view, a Reform victory would clearly have been the greatest, most dramatic earthquake possible. Second best result from a news point of view, particularly given the way the campaign had been, is a Labour victory against the odds. Now, it's a demonstration, I think, of the way in which the mood music around a by-election, and by-elections are always slightly different from a normal general election campaign, but it's a reminder of the way in which the mood music around a by-election can sometimes be at odds with the way that voters in a particular constituency actually end up voting, because the mood music in this contest was all Labour are in trouble. This is a seat that Labour ought to win. If Labour was serious about making significant inroads against the SNP at next year's Holyrood election, this is the kind of seat Labour have to win. So any kind of Labour defeat, even by a handful of votes in this constituency, I think would have been interpreted by everybody, well, people like me, people like you, as very bad news for Anna Sawar and Labour more generally. Consequently, a Labour victory, however small or slim, and this actually isn't a super slim victory, and it's on a relatively high turnout, a higher turnout than many people, I think, forecast. I think the turnout's around 44%, isn't it? Is astonishingly good news for Labour. I mean, I was at Holyrood earlier this afternoon, and people were talking there about how it's quite tight. There were a number of people I spoke to who said, well, I put a tenner on Labour to win. And I said, why did you do that? And they said, because Labour were 12-1. It was the value bet in that sense. So, there is no downside to this result whatsoever for Anna Sawar. As always, I think with by-elections, they can be over-interpreted. If one thinks of the Runcorn by-election to the House of Commons, Labour lose that by 6 votes, Reform win it by 6 votes. Functionally, that is no different from if the result had been the other way around in terms of the overall national picture and so on. But psychologically, it is extremely different. And something similar may be said here. I think if Labour had lost this by-election by a couple of hundred votes, we'd be thinking, well, that's quite a good result for the SNP if they've held it after nearly 2 decades in power. The fact Labour have won is quite transformational, I think, for the mood within Scottish Labour, which has been very anxious and fractious, I think, in recent months. And so, there is no downside to Labour from this result whatsoever. Clearly, Reform's result is something we'll come on and talk about in a bit. But Paul Sweeney, thank you very much for joining us. I suppose, we're recording this just 20 minutes or so after the result has been announced. What's your immediate reaction to it?
Well, one of relief, really. It's been a real slog of a campaign. I think it's fair to say that the campaign was characterised by a real sense of disillusionment with all parties. And I think we were all picking up the insurgency of reform, not so much a pro-reform vote, but an anti-mainstream party vote. And I think that's something that all parties will need to reflect on. But nonetheless, a really positive outcome, and a massive congratulations, David Russell. I think he will be a doughty champion for the constituency. He's a well-kent face. I think the level of endorsements he was getting was significant in that regard, and I'm sure he will be an effective representative of the people of that constituency where he was born and brought up. And I think in terms of the wider aspects of the campaign, Labour has, of course, secured a significant result last year, amazing result, really, coming back from a near existential event in 2015. But I think it's now clear that there are no such things as safe seats in Scotland. There's such a flux, and we need to work hard. I think as we move towards the Scottish elections next year, there will be a focus on the fact that the SNP have run the country for 18 years. Indeed, I was still in high school when the SNP came to power, and John Sweeney was the deputy first minister, or was certainly senior in the government at the time, and then became, of course, first minister. The challenges, of course, are significant in this country. There are no easy fixes, and I think there's a lot of frustration out there in the voters. They want to see improvements. Obviously, Labour has some challenging economic headwinds to overcome. There's been a difficult legacy from the previous government, but I think we need to get on track quicker in terms of transforming that narrative and getting people feeling that this Labour government is making a tangible improvement to people's lives, and that can give us a good tailwind going into 2026. But also thinking about 18 years of SNP rule, I mean, the reality is that it's the same faces, the same characters that have been there since I was a child. I think Scotland is yearning for a change. And I think as people are focusing on that choice between an ass as First Minister, John Swinney, who was around when I was, in primary school as a senior figure in the SNP.
Paul. I mean, in fairness,
uh,
Kate Forbes was also in primary school then, so it's not
it's
entirely the
ironic,
same old
Kate,
faces.
Kate Forbes and I actually lived on the same street as kids. It's like,
Really? Did you play together?
I only found out because my mum reminded me of it when she was running for the leadership. So that was Katie, used to live across the street. So we were actually, believe it or not, childhood playmates. I didn't even remember that, but there we go. So yes, that's true. But nonetheless, we've had John Swinney's a fixture of Scottish politics all my life, pretty much. I think the country is yearning for a new generation of leadership, and that's certainly something that Anash represents.
Well, a little bit of analysis, Paul, and then maybe a question to you. I think just the usual health warnings. By-elections are never definitive indicators of what happens at a national election, but this is an important one because it's the biggest snapshot of opinion that we have since the general election. Of course, if Labour were polling anything like the way they were polling in Lanarkshire constituencies in the general election, this would have been won by a thumping majority. That being said, it's been a difficult first 11 months for Labour at Westminster. And based upon the 8 polls that we have had in Scotland since the turn of the year, one would have expected that the result of the by-election, based upon the trend in the polls, is that this would have been an SNP hold, Labour second, and referendum would have come third. That would have been the running order if this was broadly mirroring what has gone on in the polls. It hasn't actually. And I think the good news for the Labour Party tonight is that it hasn't reflected what's actually been happening in the polls. And we'll recall that during the course of the by-election, the First Minister certainly midway was punting the message, this is a two-horse race. It's between the SNP and Reform. Well, that clearly wasn't the case. And given that the SNP vote is down by 17%, it is going to cause SNP strategists to pause because a lot of these electoral calculus projections, based upon what we have in the opinion polls, suggests that on 33, 34% of the vote, the SNP would mop up the great majority of the constituencies next year because of the fragmentation in the unionist vote. So I'm going to make a prediction that Reform will poll nothing like this in a general election scenario, because insurgents always do well in by elections, less well when the issue becomes electing a government. And given that I think that the Tories are effectively finished and Reform will finish them off, I suspect that some people in the constituency who were voting Reform yesterday will actually go back to the Labour fold. And the encouraging thing, and let me get your view on this, is that Labour were in pole position 11 months ago to win the Holyrood election. The polls have been miserable, and the SNP, before this by election, thought that they were in pole position. The real message, I think, of tonight is that there's all to play for. It's game on.
Mm. Well, I think there has been an air of hubris from the SNP, combined with a degree of cynicism. I have to say, it's been quite unedifying, not just the toxicity of Reform in this by-election and everything that they represent, which is a fairly odious manipulation of people's frustrations with politics, but also the fact that the SNP rather cynically were talking them up in that way. And I think we've seen that before. It's, English nationalism meeting Scottish nationalism, and they are two malevolent forces sawing away at the integrity of the UK in many ways, and they're at it again. We saw it in 2019 with the SNP talking up "Stop Boris, Stop Brexit," which is the biggest load of humbug ever, and it resulted in precisely the opposite. So I think they've been at it again in this by-election, and I'm glad they were sent packing, to be honest with you. And it's a really satisfying victory in that sense, because I have to say we were on tenterhooks. There was no sense of buoyancy in our approach. We were working hard on the ground, desperate to turn out our Labour voters, desperate to connect with the constituents. We weren't approaching this with any sort of hubris. There was just a grim determination to try and see it through, and it's paid off in the end. And it's thanks to the efforts of thousands of people who came out to support the Labour candidate, and it paid off in the end. So I think looking towards 2026, I think you're right. It will be narrow. I think Reform will fold up, like a crisp packet on a cooker. I think they are an expression of transient frustration, but the ultimate frustration is with 18 years of dysfunctional government in Scotland. And I think when people are faced with the opportunity to batter it down, the obvious choice is to vote for Labour. It's the only alternative government in Scotland. And I think we will see, as a result of that focus, a narrowing as we approach 2026. And as we've seen in recent years, Scottish politics is volatile, and I think we will see that trend continue towards 2026, and I think we will see a narrowing in the polls in the coming months.
I mean, one of the things in this by-election, again, speaking to people of Labour people and people from other parties at Holyrood in the last few days, that people said was, sure, the First Minister wants to make this an SNP reform fight for his own reasons, quite transparently, I think, what those reasons are. But one thing to bear in mind is that Labour have sent an awful lot of people into the constituency to knock doors. People from all around Scotland, people from outside Scotland as well. That Labour's ground game, the muscle that Labour was able to bring to that operation, is something that perhaps shouldn't be discounted, and might well prove to be more influential than many people are currently suggesting. And I suppose that is probably borne out by the result. Now, that is possible in a single constituency by-election. It's rather harder to repeat across a national election. Nevertheless, I'd just like to ask you something about something that you brought up there, Pods, or where you talked about Reform being an English nationalist party. Now, that is very much the consensus view, I suppose, if you like, amongst in the political bubble in Scotland, or the political village in Scotland. But let me put it to you, Zod, that if voters saw Reform as an English nationalist party, there isn't a chance in hell that 1 in 4 people in Hamilton, Stonehouse, and Larkhall would have voted for a party they considered to be an English nationalist party. So I'm slightly dubious about this characterization of the party. They might be an English nationalist party. Okay, fine. But I think this result demonstrates, doesn't it, that people don't see them as such.
It's an interesting point, and on reflection, what you say is a fair correction. I think there is a British nationalist element to it. There's clearly an identity issue there, focused around talking points that I heard on the doors around immigration, issues around cultural differences, which I think are concerning. That there is this sense of disaffection, and clearly in Scotland we need to be real about the realities of that. We can't be in some conceit that we are morally superior, and the reality is that we have a lot of work
If Scottish
to
politics doesn't have that, Paul, what does it have?
do.
That's the whole
There is
foundation of the Parliament.
a real sense of alienation out there, and I think you're right. We're seeing it in the recent by-election in Glasgow City Council when Reform ran Labour and the SNP a close third again in Easterhouse with similar talking points. One of the main talking points was issue of asylum integration in the east end of the city. I think we need to be real about that. There's a housing crisis in Glasgow and the wider west of Scotland, and we need to do more to talk about how we can improve community cohesion. Is a huge part in what we need to do. But I also think there needs to be this discussion about how migration needs to be on terms that benefit the whole community. And that's what's important. We need to explain that better to people. There's this narrative that's going rather unchallenged at the moment that people are arriving and getting all these benefits and all these perks that are coming into this, whilst hard, long-suffering residents aren't getting the same benefits. And I think that's incorrect. But we haven't done nearly enough to explain that. And we've went through this process before in Glasgow. We had in Sighthill 20 odd years ago a murder of a Kurdish asylum seeker. There was real community unrest in the city at that time, where we had a recent spike in migration. We were able to overcome that with really good integration work. And I think there needs to be a lot more humility in Scottish politics and a lot more concern about the need to rebuild community cohesion in places like Glasgow, where we're seeing a significant increase in recent migration to the city. That's a good problem to have in many ways, because Glasgow desperately needs to expand its population. The west of Scotland needs to grow much quicker than it currently is. It's actually in relative decline in population. We've got an ageing population in Scotland. We've got a declining workforce. So we do need to meet these challenges, but we need to do it with a degree of humility and a degree of concern about the potential for this breakdown in community cohesion. I think there is an expression of frustration there. And maybe it has been expressed through this British nationalist prism. There's a lot of, primarily English nationalist talking points that Reform, are becoming unstuck on around things like abolishing the Barnett formula, the huge fiscal impacts that would have in Scotland, the blind spot.
Well, I mean, to be fair, that's SNP policy too.
Well, quite, and that's again
Within the United Kingdom, I should stress.
Where the idea of pooling and sharing and solidarity fiscally is something that's anathema to both those parties, and it's a common contradiction, where their kind of cakeism, shows them to be fundamentally unserious when it comes to the economics of the country. But yeah, we need to seriously get a grip of this in Scotland, because I think there is this challenge. We aren't building our way out of the problem quickly enough. We aren't investing heavily enough in our infrastructure to deal with a growing population, and as a result, there is this frustration that people aren't feeling that their living standards are improving.
I can see that we are joined by Councillor Thomas Kerr. I hope Thomas can hear us okay. Good morning to you at 2:20, Thomas Kerr.
Good morning from the Premier Inn in Hamilton.
Gosh, and people say that politics is a rough trade.
Well, we've just been chewing for the last 20 minutes the result with Paul Sweeney. We've done a congratulations to Labour, but I think in a sort of spirit of equanimity, we should say congratulations to Reform UK as well, because it's a pretty astonishing result in what was a former mining community to go from 0% to 26.1%. So give me your take and your analysis of something which was so near in the end. I mean, just a matter of 3 percentage points behind the SNP.
Yeah, well, look, firstly, congratulations to Paul and to Labour and to Davy Russell for being elected. It's not easy to put yourself forward for election, and I know Davy's come under a lot of scrutiny, but obviously he's been able to win, so congratulations to Labour for that. But I think that this is seismic, Bernard. I mean, I was expecting that we would get a good result. I didn't expect it to be as close as it was between the three main parties in Scottish politics, which I think that now is the case with Reform UK. I'm astonished with it, to be honest with you. I thought we could get second place. I thought it might be at Paul's party's expense. I didn't think we'd be closer to ousting the SNP from second place, and I think that this is a big change of politics of where we're heading in this country.
I mean, thanks very much for joining us, Thomas. It's great to have you on the show and taking the time to be with us. To what do you ascribe Reform going from, I think in 2021, Reform's candidate won 58 votes in this constituency. You now have almost 8,000. To what do you ascribe that?
Yeah, Ross done a little bit better than the candidate the last time around, I think. I think we've managed to speak to the mood of the country at the current moment, which is that they are scunnered, angry and fed up. And it's that famous word that I feel like I've been using for the past 4 months non-stop, but it is, people are just really frustrated with the whole political system. And they see Reform UK as an opportunity to vent their anger towards the main parties, but also to see a bit of hope as to what it is that we want to try and do with the country, offering something different. We have 5 political parties in Holyrood that kind of agree with mostly everything. There's very little that divides them. And I think that what Reform is offering is a unique opportunity for voters. So I'm very excited about where we go. We have outperformed what John Curtis and what the polls are currently saying that we're doing with 26% of the vote. I think that's a remarkable result for somewhere in central Scotland. So I think it's a really, really seismic result.
I don't mean this in any sense in a churlish way or to try and take the gloss out of what is a very, very good result for your party. But obviously, there's not a direct correlation between what you get in a parliamentary by-election to what you're likely to poll in a general election scenario where people are electing a government. Now, there's lots of examples, and I won't bore you with going back through lots of by-elections where there's been fantastic results for parties, and they evaporate and they disappear. But I think that even your opponents would concede that there is a mood within the country. Call it insurgent if you want, call it scunnered if you want. There is a sense in which there is a crisis of the political mainstream, and I think your opponents would not argue that some of the underlying factors that have driven this result for you yesterday are likely to disappear in the next year. So, given that it's a very, very good result, I personally, I'm putting my neck of the chopping block here, do not think that you will be at 26% of the vote at the election when we get there, but we'll see. What do you think is a realistic expectation for your party next May?
Well, I hope to prove you wrong, Bernard, to start with, because I think that you're right, that it is easy right now to be the angry voice, and we are the angry voice. And I've been very open about this over the past 4 months since I joined Reform UK. We are the party that people who are angry and fed up are using to express their anger. We have a big job over the next year, and that is to provide a coherent policy platform going into that Holyrood election. I'm working behind the scenes with people senior in Reform to make sure that that policy platform is there. So I don't have a number to be able to tell you, because I couldn't predict 4 months ago that we would be getting 26% of the vote in Hamilton. I couldn't predict that we would be beating Labour into second place in Clydebank. These are by-elections, absolutely, but it's a mood of the country, and I think that when Reform starts to put our policy platform together, when we start to see other people across Scotland who will come forward as candidates, and when we start to be part of the mainstream now that we are in terms of speaking to the media and other things, I think that could open up a huge dynamic for us in Scottish politics. So I don't have a number. If I did, I would give you one, but I genuinely think that we're at a stage in Scottish politics where the Conservative Party is gone. They've disappeared entirely. The Liberal Democrats, who were hoping to try and recover slightly, haven't. The Green Party looks to be in trouble, and I think that we're looking now at seriously a fight between the SNP, Labour and Reform in areas right across the country. That's exciting, but it's also daunting, and I don't take away from the fact that Reform has a big job to do between now and the Holyrood election. election to offer a coherent policy platform, because a lot of people put their trust in us. 26% of the electorate in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse yesterday voted Reform. That's a huge section of society that is giving us our vote. That's a huge section of society that's given us our trust. We don't take that for granted, so it's my job and it's the job of Reform to make sure we have a coherent policy platform to offer them that bit of hope going into the Holyrood election.
Do you think, Thomas, do you think that that Reform's suggestion that Anas Sarwar had introduced sectarianism into Lanarkshire politics and that he would privilege the Pakistani community, presumably at the expense of what you might term the white Scottish community, do you think that helped or harmed you?
I don't think it made much of a difference, to be honest with you. I think if you speak to people as much as I did in the constituency, and I've spent nearly every single day in Hamilton for the past 3-4 weeks, it didn't come up other than when I was doing press interviews. I get why it made people uncomfortable. I think what Reform done was highlight a speech that Anna gave that, I found uncomfortable, some of the stuff that he'd said in it, and we gave our interpretation as to what it was that we thought that was, and it's up to the people of Scotland to decide themselves. But Anna Sarwar was a man who's hoping to be First Minister, and by the result that he had tonight, he could seriously be First Minister. 2 days ago, nobody was talking about that seriously. He could be First Minister. And I think it's right that past speeches that he's given, past views that he's held, should be scrutinised properly.
Paul,
just before we bring
I think we should bring Paul in to respond to that, perhaps, shouldn't we?
Well, I think Thomas made a point there about the fact that when they developed their policy platform, the fact is that Reform had no policies other than to stir bigotry in the community, really, and I think that is reprehensible in its approach ethically, if not nothing else. I thought it was a rather desperate attempt to stir up that kind of behavior, and I have to say it was brought up on the doors on several occasions by me, to my real disappointment. And it clearly was a cynical attempt to tap into this undercurrent of suspicion and paranoia that has been stirred up by Reform politicians in this country, particularly against the Pakistani community in our country, which have done so much to contribute to our national life. And I think it's shocking that this has been done. And I think that what Anas has been talking about is the immense pride that the South Asian community in Glasgow and the west of Scotland have in the public contribution they've made to our country. And I think it's something we should celebrate, not try and cast aspersions on in this cynical way. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, we have a duty as a country to talk up the immense benefits that we have as a whole community of the wealth that all of us bring, and to the opportunity we can create together to grow our economy, grow our population, grow our cities. And that's what we need to be doing going into the forthcoming Scottish election, because, my goodness, we have a lot of big structural problems in Scotland, not the least our declining and ageing and sicker population. So we're going to have to deal with those big structural problems in our country. And what Reform is offering is simply a recipe for further national decline. Howling at the moon in this way isn't going to solve these problems. It's just going to drive further frustration. So I think we need to get real about the nature of the challenge. And I do think that there will be a polarisation when we come closer to the election. It's a choice between another 5 years of SNP rule. As I mentioned, they've been in government since I was still in high school, or it's going to be an opportunity to change the Scottish government. And the only way to change the Scottish government is to elect Anas Sarwar as First Minister and to elect a Labour-led administration at the Scottish Parliament.
Thomas?
I mean, look, me and Paul obviously have a disagreement when it comes to the particular advert, but I think that what that answer shows me is that Labour might get a bit caught up in their own arrogance here.
Certainly not arrogant,
Reform came nearly 1,500 votes from winning this seat. 26% of people in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse voted for Reform. Now, I'm happy to debate Paul on policy issues. He said that Reform doesn't have policies. I've been very open about that, but we still managed to nearly run the Labour Party 1,500 votes close of beating them in central Scotland. So I think that there's a big issue for Labour there. But our position will be, over the next year, we will develop policy platforms that will go forward for people in Scotland, offering a real alternative. Because the reality is, when you look at Anas Sarwar or John Sweeney, other than the independence issue, there's very much that divides these two men. They are both to the left of politics. They both want to raise taxes. They both have knee-jerk reaction to issues when it comes to the private sector having investment inside Scotland. They both support, anti-development policies like rent caps and all this sort of stuff. So all of these policies are still policies that both Paul and the SNP agree with. And I think that that's a huge opening for Reform UK to offer a real alternative for people across Scotland. And that's what my job is, and the job of Reform over the next year to try and offer.
Well, let me ask you about who was actually sort of voting for reform in the constituency on Thursday, because I noticed that on the BBC results programme, the Reform UK spokeswoman was Helen McDade. Now, I first met Helen McDade way back in 1984 when she was a prominent member of the SDP in Scotland. So her politics probably back then were centre left. So there's an example, and actually she drifted out of politics after the merger between the SDP and the Liberals, and she's been brought, in a sense, back into politics on the basis of Reform UK. And if we look at the figures in the constituency, I mean, the Tory vote down from 17.5% to 6%. But if it got any lower, we were into lost deposit territory. I'm going to buy and I'm going to agree with the general thrust that whatever else happens to reform over the course of the next year, they're going to bury the Scottish Tories. I am absolutely will not dissent from that analysis at all. But I am interested, and I think you referenced the Clydebank by-election, local authority by-election. I mean, who's actually voting for you? Because there ain't a lot of Tories in Clydebank, and okay, there was a base of support for the Tories in 2021, which I suspect was still a hangover vote from the referendum. So who's actually voting? Who are you hitting the hardest?
Well, I think that this is the exciting thing about Reform, Bernard, and I think we're taking votes from every single political party. This week we had a Labour councillor who joined our ranks. We've, as you mentioned, Helen McDade, who was one time in the SDP. I was a former Conservative. I've had people who in polling stations today were telling me they used to vote SNP. But we're also engaging with people who have not voted in many, many years because they feel so scunnered with the whole political system. What is exciting about Reform, and it's a challenge for us as well, I'm not going to make any lies about that. We've got a year time to try and build up something magical for the Holyrood election. But what is a huge opportunity for Reform is we are taking votes from everywhere. So areas like Clydebank, where even in the Ruth Davidson positivity of the Scottish Conservatives, the Tories were not picking up seats. We are doing really, really remarkably well there. In places like Glasgow North East, Paul's own patch up in Easterhouse, we were running Labour very, very close there. And now you look at seats like Hamilton, we were 1,500 votes away from beating Labour here and nearly overtaking the SNP. So we're taking votes from everybody. And it is that general people are so fed up and angry. When we start to outline our policy platform, I think that those people will stick with us because I think that there's a centre-right vote that exists in Scotland, but it feels uncomfortable voting Conservative in many places across central Scotland and in west of Scotland. And I think Reform is offering a unique opportunity to give people a chance to vote for something very, very different than the cosy consensus that's existed inside the Holyrood Parliament. Because the problem that the Scottish Conservatives, part of the reason I left the Scottish Conservative Party, is because they gave up entirely in central Scotland and the west of Scotland. And what we've seen tonight and in other by-election results is that that's coming home to roost. All those years when Ruth Davidson managed to pick up swathes of votes was totally ignored for years, and they've now become a fringe party essentially of the borders. And they deserve it because that's what they've managed to do. And I think Reform is going to eat up all of that vote. But we're also taking votes from Labour, SNP, non-voters, everybody right across. And I think that's what's really exciting. It's also why our opponents are terrified because they don't know how to tackle us. Because how do you attack a political party that's taking votes from the SNP, from Labour, and from the Conservatives? How do you try and do that? And it's why our opponents are a bit worried.
Well, as somebody from the borders and so on, I'm going to say that there is nothing wrong with being a party, that is purely of the borders and so on. In fact, there could be few things better in Scottish politics than to be a borders party. But Thomas, let me put this to you and so on. You say you're taking votes from Labour, from the Conservatives, obviously, and also a few from the SNP. Let me suggest to you that is a current strength for Reform, but it is predicated on the fact that you do not have any policies and you do not have very many recognisable people, no disrespect to your good self, and that consequently people can project onto Reform all kinds of things, whether those are credible or fantastical is neither here nor there. That Reform is an idea, a mood, a sensibility, not a political party in the traditional sense, not a coherent political party that has a suite of policies that people might wish to see implemented were you somehow to end up in government. And consequently, the very worst thing that you can do is to develop some policies, because that will give people reason not to vote for you. Whereas at the moment, you benefit from not having any policies.
I think I've already said, Alex, I fully accept that reform's strength now is that people are so angry and they're using us as a mechanism to share that. But the reality is, I'm in politics to bring effective change. I didn't get into politics just to shout the odds. I'm a working class guy who grew up in East End of Glasgow who joined the Scottish Tories, not because I wanted to be in politics, because I genuinely care about centre-right politics. So I want to get us to a stage where we can start talking about policy, and I get that is I can understand why it's can be nervous for people because, when we start talking about policy, we might put people off. The reality is politics that's very cold, though, is about principle, and it's about trying to convince people to support your side. I'm very, very happy to put policy platforms down and to go to the electorate and say, this is what I stand for. Here I am. You don't like me, don't vote for me. And I'm very happy to do that. If it means that reform slightly goes down in the polls, then so be it. But we're going to stand on a policy platform for next year because I think that our policy platform will be the right one for Scotland. We're not going to rush it, though. And let me be very, very clear, just because our opponents want us to have policies or they want us to have a figurehead leader because what they really want is something to attack. We're not going to rush it. We'll do it in our own steady. We will have a manifesto for the Holyrood election, but we're not going to rush something because our opponents want something to tear us apart with. That's just not the case. I've watched too many podcasts where Bernard has warned everybody about the former shakes of UKIP and everything else when you rush policy. We will have this developed properly and it will be very effective when it comes out.
The ghosts
Well,
of
it's 20
Change
to 3 in the
UK.
morning.
We should talk about
It's
the
20
SNP
to 3
budget.
in the morning, and some people need their bed. So I think we're going to round it off where I'm going to ask all three of you to give a little commentary on what you think the legacy of this by-election is. There sometimes is a terrible tendency in which you end up reading far too much, and there'll no doubt be lots of commentaries in the papers on Saturday and Sunday. And some people will want to stick their head in the oven, and some people will celebrate prematurely. So, a question to all three of you, and Alec can answer it sort of finally and take us out. Paul Sweeney, starting with you, what do you think the legacy of the vote on Thursday is?
Well, I think it reasserts the point that there's a clear binary choice next year in the Scottish elections. You can continue with 18 years of failed SNP government, or we can change it and have a new generation running Scottish government, and that would be by the election of a Labour-led administration. And I think that's the key thing. And I don't think that we're going to see a structural change in Scottish politics with regards to reform. I personally think it's just shaping up to be a carpetbaggers convention, and we'll see it basically fold up when subjected to any real political scrutiny. And I think the dog ate our homework in regards to policy isn't really going to cut it. There does need to be something to say. It's not just good enough to rely on frustrations with other parties to be a receptacle for that. That's good in a by-election. It's not going to work when you're trying to run the Scottish government. And that's where we're going to see a real tightening of the polling in the coming months towards our clear choice of, giving the SNP a third decade in government, or actually changing that for a Labour government. And I think we're going to see a big upset as we get closer to the Scottish elections.
Thomas.
Well, I hope this arrogance continues, I must tell you. Look, I think what we will see is that we are now in the state of three-party politics. I genuinely think that is the case in Scotland. I think the Scottish Conservatives are gone. I think the Liberal Democrats are not going to recover. And I think across central Scotland, Glasgow, places in the west, and right across Scotland, it will now be a fight between Paul's party, Reform, and the SNP. And I think that's exciting for Scottish politics. I think that the attitude of Paul and the SNP will be to put their fingers in their head and fingers in the razor, and just hope that Reform explodes. That's not going to be the case at all. Instead, what we're going to do is come up with some serious policy which will challenge the cosy consensus that exists in Holyrood. And I think we're going to prove a lot of people wrong. We already have started to. When I joined Reform 4 months ago, people were laughing at us. Well, they're not laughing now because we're placing people very, very close to winning seats. If this had been 2 weeks later, who knows what could have been the result. So I think we're genuinely at a moment in Scottish politics where we'll see a huge transformation.
Well, I'm sure anyway.
Okay, well, finally, there was a guy that called Douglas Stewart who used to present a program called The World Tonight. And Douglas Stewart's favourite question is, what does it mean? And to tell us what it means, We go to the Borders sage himself to take us out. Comrade Massey.
Well, Bernard, you will recall better than most people, of course, that in 1978, after the Glasgow Garscadden by-election, Donald
Indeed.
Cllr said, "This result changes the whole psychological climate of Scottish politics." And now, perhaps it is going a little too far to say that this result in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse does something similar, but I think we can draw a couple of conclusions from it, even allowing for the usual "it's only a by-election" caveats and so on. First is that this is a necessary but hugely significant result for the Labour Party, first and foremost, because I think if Labour had come third, for instance, tonight, then it's not that Anna Sarwar would have been doomed, but the entire mood around Labour would have been very despondent. I think the suggestion that Labour could make serious gains next May would be discounted in most circles. The second thing to say about it is that it is quite clearly a stunning result for Reform UK. Whether it is repeated at a general election for the Scottish Parliament remains to be seen. But of course, Reform can have a huge impact on that election without winning any constituencies. Most of the time, Reform's presence in next year's election seems likely to be felt on the regional list. And a result like this does suggest that Reform could pick up at least two MSPs in most regions of Scotland, possibly every region of Scotland, and that would be sufficient to elect around 15 or so MSPs, and that would change the makeup of the Holyrood Parliament and the temper of the Holyrood Parliament quite considerably. So, to that extent, Reform's result tonight does suggest that, at least in the short term, they may well prove to be a player in Scottish politics. And I suppose the third thing, and we haven't really talked about this very much, Bernard, and I think, I'd like to hear what you think about this as well before we finish and so on, is that we should note that this is a terrible result for the SNP. It suggests that if the national polls are a bit up and down about where Labour happened to be or where Reform happened to be in a given constituency, they have the SNP vote about right. Which is that the SNP is currently the party favoured by around 1 in 3 Scottish voters. They did a little less well than that, a little worse than that in Hamilton tonight. And that is not a situation which is terribly good for the SNP. It puts them about 15 points down on their national share of the vote in 2021. It suggests that in most seats in Scotland, there is currently a significant anti-SNP or non-SNP majority. And so we are a far cry, a long, long way away from the halcyon glory days when the SNP could count on winning 50% of the vote in constituencies across Scotland. Remember, in 2021, the SNP won 49% of the vote in this constituency. They're now down to 30. And that is something that we have that bears consideration. We have taken the SNP's supremacy in Scottish politics almost for granted for a very, very long period of time. And I'm not sure that we can do that anymore.
Yeah, just very briefly on that. I mean, it's an absolutely fair point. I think the last Scottish-wide poll had the SNP at 33%. That was down 15 percentage points comparison to where they were in 2021. So minus 15 across the polls, minus 17 in this constituency. I still will hold to the view, smashing result though this is for Reform UK, they will not, when it comes to the issue of electing a government, be polling 26.1% in constituencies like this. And I think if they fall back, it will be to the Labour Party's benefit. But what I take from, and incidentally, just a word on turnout, at 44.2% in the constituency, the turnout in this seat in 2011 was only 45%. So if people try to spin, don't take too much into this because, it was a by-election turnout. As by-election turnouts go, it wasn't at all bad. Rutherglen and Hamilton West, the Westminster constituency, neighbouring seat, was 37%. And given that the reporting of this by-election, only really came in the last 7 or 8 days, there was not blanket reporting, particularly on broadcast, for 3 or 4 weeks the way you would normally get. So a decent turnout, a good result for Labour in constituencies like this, where I don't think reform will repeat this in a general election scenario. It is completely game on across a whole series of constituencies. I, for one, on the basis of this, ain't predicting how the next Scottish election's going.
No, well, only a mug would do that at present. And Bernard, you're no mug.
Thank you.
Thomas Kerr from Reform, Paul Sweeney from Labour. Thank you both for joining us on the podcast. It's very early in the morning or late at night, depending which way you prefer to look at it. So we're very grateful to you for giving up your time to share your thoughts and analysis of perhaps the most interesting Holyrood by-election one can remember in really quite a long time.
Ever.
Well, I mean, it's a low bar, admittedly, but always one worth clearing. Thank you very much for being with us. We shall see how the next year pans out. Many of the issues that we've talked about here this evening and so on, we will doubtless return to at some point in the future. But for the time being, and thank you to all of our listeners for being with us, for the time being, it's goodbye from me.
And good night and good morning from me.